Good morning. My name is Charles Capron. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the resolution of World War II in the Pacific. Specifically, I'm going to talk about why the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the motivations behind Eisenhower's decision to do so, and ultimately why there may have been a better route to take. So the main point I'd like to address first is that the idea that there were only two possible resolutions to the war in the Pacific, those being either a massive land invasion of Japan or the dropping of the atomic bombs. So, if that were the case, then yes, absolutely, the atomic bombs would have been completely justified. Um, Invasion casualty estimates were as large as like 250,000 Americans were going to die in the invasion. So, I think arguing from that premise, then yes, absolutely, the invasion would have been, or the atomic bombs would have been justified. However, I don't think the evidence supports that that is actually the case. Um, Modeling the Japanese government and people as a completely vicious foe that would absolutely fight down to the last man no matter what, barring anything short of nuclear war, is I think that's too simplistic. On page 820 of our textbook, it's noted that even before the atomic attacks, the conventional bombings of Japan, the defeat of its forces in the field, and the entry of the Soviet Union into the war had convinced the Imperial Council that they had to end the war. So basically, Japan was already realized that the war had to be ended. Um, Given that, I think there were better options for a less costly peace. One of them involves Russia's pretty recent then recent entry into the Pacific Theater, the Allied operations in the Pacific Theater. So, Germany had recently been defeated, and previously Russia had to devote pretty much all of the resources to the Eastern Front. I guess the Western Front for Russia, but the Eastern Front from the perspective of the rest of Europe. So now that Germany had been defeated, and Italy as well, Russia was free to devote all of its resources to the war in the Pacific, and that could very well have been the complete turning point for Japan. That is, like at that point, Japan could have recognized, hey, there's absolutely no way that we are going to have anything even approaching a favorable outcome to this war. And that could have precipitated Japan's surrender. However, the timing of the initiation of Russian hostilities with regards to Japan that's quite interesting. So the first military action that Russia took against Japan was the invasion of then Japanese-controlled Manchuria, and that invasion occurred on August 9th, 1945. So August 9th, that is 3 days after the first atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, and it's the same day as the second atomic bomb. So that didn't really. By the time Russia had actually, in fact, gotten into the Allied military efforts in the European theater, Japan had already experienced the two atomic bombs. So perhaps if the Russians had invaded sooner, or the bombings were put off until later, that invasion in and of itself would have been enough to convince the Japanese government as well as the emperor that that surrender was really the only option. And if that had happened, two entire cities with their populations could have been completely spared. Obviously, that was not the case. So further, even if you accept the premise that atomic bombs were the only alternative to large-scale invasion, which like I said, I don't necessarily accept, but even if you do, the justification of the dropping of the second bomb is still fairly hard to swallow. So the first bomb was dropped on August 6th, 1945, and it instantly killed tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians. And then throughout the next couple months, killed about as many in secondary radiation effects. And the second one came fairly soon after that, but 3 days, but still like fairly soon. So the the Japanese government didn't have a whole lot of time to surrender before another entire city was annihilated. I think it's kind of easy to get caught up in thinking that the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings were, one event, but they were two separate events, and potentially one of them would have sufficed for the Japanese government's surrender. So perhaps if the U.S. had once again been a little bit more patient, quite a few innocent lives could have been spared, and include like an entire city's worth. So I've kind of been railing against the Allied mistakes, but that's not the impression I want to leave with. The U.S. could certainly have been more patient. Well, the Allies could have been more patient, but that's not the only thing that contributed to the loss of life at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, as mentioned before, the Japanese government was they already knew that the war was coming to a close. If they had been more prompt with their surrender, instead of waiting out, hoping that they could get a more favorable set of surrender conditions, if they had been more prompt, if they had issued a surrender on August 6th or August 7th or August 8th, they could have prevented the second bombings. Even before that, if they had surrendered along with Germany, once it was clear that the Allies were already had Germany completely defeated and were about to focus all of their efforts on Japan, I mean, there's no coming back from that. And the Japanese government recognized that, but they held out hoping that they could obtain more favorable surrender conditions. And that hesitation to surrender cost hundreds of thousands of Japanese lives. So I think it's, while there's plenty of blame to go around, I think quite a bit of it rests largely with Hirohito and his Imperial Council for not surrendering more quickly. Basically, pride got in their way, and two of their cities were annihilated partially as a result of that. So, in conclusion, the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are fairly often labeled as inevitable and also the only alternative to a greater evil, a far greater evil. I'd argue that patience and a more incremental escalation of war could have resulted in far, far fewer deaths. And further, that does not excuse the actions of the Japanese government from any culpability. Both the United States, all of the Allies, as well as Japan, were quite complicit in the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thank you.